Bonjour, and welcome on the Gospel Spice podcast, where you are invited to taste and see that the Lord is good. Gospel Spice is your Christ-centered podcast, infused with in-depth biblical flavors and sprinkled with a dash of French culture to spice up your relationship with God. Here is your host, Stéphanie Roussel.
There is a spice that has a particular memory for me, nutmeg. You see, I can't taste nutmeg even today without traveling back in time to my grandmother's kitchen. She wove nutmeg into her culinary story every time she made her signature quiche Lorraine. No one was nearly as good as her at elevating fresh bacon with cream and nutmeg. I highly recommend it. So nutmeg reminds me of someone who loved me, as only a grandma can, and so I love nutmeg. You see, she raised me for a while my parents were getting divorced and my mom had to work long hours to make ends meet. And it was a pretty lonely and bitter season of my life. And so much as I loved my grandma, nutmeg also reminds me that she was there because my parents were not. And so nutmeg is also very bitter for me. Nutmeg is my bittersweet memory spice, if you will. So what spice do you have that might scream childhood memories to you? You see, family memory spices such as nutmeg for me are part and parcel of our bittersweet heritage, passed down from one generation to the next. They can be as sweet as quiche Lorraine and a loving grandma, or as bitter as family shame, bad habits, and broken relationships. Some spices such as abuse or abandon can be downright poisonous, and they can flavor the family tree for generations. And Jesus' family tree is no exception. I wonder what family memory spices he would mention. Some of his ancestors sprinkled his genealogy with very sweet and respected spices, while others, well, not so much. I suspect that Jesus got teased during recess over some of the names in his lineage. Other names in his ancestry probably triggered some respectful whistles. So let's travel down Jesus' generational memory lane in Matthew 1. Welcome to our Christmas season. Matthew chapter 1 opens the entire New Testament with 42 names in all, from Abraham to Jesus. I'm not going to read it to you, because honestly, who has time for a long-winded genealogy? Raise your hand right now, even if I'm not seeing you, if you've never skipped over lists while reading your Bible. Seriously, we've all done it. Lists of names, lists of cities, lists of cattle, lists of numbers, lists. If you intend to make it on the New York bestseller list, you don't start your book with a list. Didn't Matthew know that? Or could it be that his opening chapter actually proved a spicy page-turner to his original audience? You see, Matthew sets the flavor profile right off the bat. In Matthew 1, verse 1, his very first words are, "This is the historical record of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham." That's in the HCSB. Abraham is the ancestor of the Jewish people, which implies that Jesus is Jewish. And David is the ultimate king of Israel, which implies that Jesus is king. So from the get-go, Jesus is introduced by Matthew as King of the Jews. In doing so, Matthew successfully grabs his original audience's attention. And in spite of our Western undiscerning palates, he actually does set out for a spicy bestseller, first century Jewish style. You see, through this historically verifiable genealogy, Matthew grounds Jesus Christ in history. Jesus is not a myth or a legend. We mentioned this briefly last week. He's not the invention of human minds, and he is not the compilation of several lives into one meta-human. Jesus Christ is described in the Gospels, and he is one person who is King of the Jews and so much more. That is all in Matthew 1:1. So this one little verse packs some serious punch, and it jumpstarts the entire chapter, the entire book of Matthew, the entire New Testament. And then Matthew proceeds to cover 3 14-generation spans in 17 verses. And you see, much to our 21st century Anglo-Saxon dismay, his point is actually not to give us a complete record of Jesus' ancestry. but much to our readers' adventuresome delight. He provides an experience that is more akin to a thundering roller coaster. Matthew's record is steeped in Jewish custom. He skips a name here and there, which is perfectly acceptable to him and his audience. There's a method to his madness, and there's a point that is well made to his readers. In Jewish culture, son is synonymous to descendant. It doesn't necessarily mean a direct father-child link. Just like Jesus, you are the son or the daughter of your great-grandfather too, and I am my grandma's daughter. Bittersweet nutmeg and all. Matthew illustrates Jesus' ancestry through 3 sets of 14 names for several reasons. One reason is purely literary. When he breaks his genealogy in equal sets, that creates a poetic harmony within the text. It's a literary device that is prized by Jewish ears, but that is unfortunately lost to us. So Matthew here is writing poetry. And he does so because it helps with memorization. It's so much easier to remember a poem or a song than a list of names. Matthew elected to record the 14 names per set for a purpose that is beyond poetry, though I promise you. Each Hebrew letter is worth a particular number. I don't know if you knew that. And so each word adds up to a specific value. Matthew and his audience all know that David echoes the number 14. And so his point is clearly made and clearly taken. Jesus and David are strongly related. In verse 6, this association imparts David's reputation as Israel's greatest king to Jesus. That is the ultimate Jewish page-turner. Jesus is basking in David's glory. Each of those 3 historical sets mean as much to the Jewish audience as the Davidic reference to 14. For example, the first of the 3 sets of names, from Abraham to David, references the period of Jewish history when God himself ruled the nation through the patriarchs and the judges, and that's roughly from 2100 BC to 1000 BC. And during that time, this very long time span, Israel obeyed God directly. That is from Abraham to David, and it's the period of the patriarchs and then the judges. Then there's a second set of names that goes from David all the way to the Babylonian exile. And that illustrates the period of the Jewish kings from 1000 BC, roughly, to 587 BC. David was God's first king to Israel, and its greatest. Manasseh was its last, and arguably the most evil. We've met him in previous episodes. Matthew reminds his audience that their ancestors rejected God's direct rule upon them when Israel requested a human king to be like the other nations. God obliged, but he had warned them of the price, and it proved steep. Manasseh is the proof of that. And through his genealogy, Matthew is reminding his audience of all of this. And the third set of 14 names is a sad one, though it is frayed with hope. Starting with the return from exiles around 500 BC, it opens with the attempts to rebuild Jerusalem, even though it's just a shadow of its former self. This final section primarily covers the silent years from 400 BC when Malachi closed the Old Testament canon to the birth of Jesus, when Matthew opens the New Testament with the very words that we are studying right now. And that third set of names includes the Roman invasion and the Maccabees insurrection that is celebrated today as Hanukkah. And it sets the tone for the world that Jesus enters in. So you and I might think that Matthew is quite straightforward when he concludes his 3 sets of 14 names in verse 16 by introducing Jesus as King of the Jews and Messiah. You see, that sweet tasting, honey-lathered Davidic connection in verse 6 goes a long way to endear Jesus to Matthew's audience, or so we think. But I doubt that his initial readers managed to make it all the way to verse 16, the end of the genealogy, without choking on their falafel as they read the sulfurous verses 11 and 12. So let's turn there for a moment. You see, there's a complete spice whiplash, and Matthew drops a cultural bomb in verses 11 and 12. We, Westerners, would have missed it if it hadn't been for the poisonous family fumes that are emanating from those names. So let me take you there. Matthew 1 provides Jesus' genealogy via Joseph's family tree through the famous Matthew's begats. as adopted son, Jesus inherits all the Joseph family ancestry, the bitter and the sweet nutmeg, the best and the worst, David and Jeconiah. Now, that is probably not a familiar name to you, but he is right there, Jeconiah, in verses 11 and 12. You see, no family would ever name a baby boy after that man. That is why you don't know his name. No one is named after him. He is that unnameable you-know-who. You don't say his name out loud. Matthew's audience would have gasped in sheer shock. Hushed tones, whispered reproaches, shameful glances. Jeconiah, or Coniah, is one of the ultimate bad boys of Scripture. He is a real-life Voldemort in Jesus' ancestry. And so Matthew really forces his audience to wonder if Jesus was a Slytherin after all. Our favorite tax collector knew that name would take them straight back to Jeremiah 22 verses 24 to 30. And there, the prophet records a powerful curse from God himself to every single one of Jeconiah's descendants. Jeremiah 22:30 reads, "None of his descendants will succeed in sitting on the throne of David." Can you hear the audience gasp? Has Voldemort's shadow returned to haunt Jesus and bar him from messiahship? Matthew has just sucked the air out of the room. He knows, his audience knows, Messiah cannot come from Jeconiah. If Jesus is genetically connected to Jeconiah, then he is barred from messiahship, order of God himself. Barely 12 verses into his very first chapter, Matthew comes to a grinding halt. And he is in no hurry to give us room to breathe. He lets us and the readers asphyxiate until verse 16. And there, instead of providing the fresh air that his audience is really in need of at that point, Matthew stomach punches his audience with more breaking news. He collides head on with a taboo topic that has been the talk of the town for decades. Can you smell the family nutmeg? In the first half of verse 16, Matthew tells us that he is describing the ancestral line of, I quote, Joseph, husband of Mary, mother of Jesus, end quote. Wait a minute. Why didn't Matthew write Joseph who begat Jesus or Joseph who fathered Jesus as he had done for every single generation in the 42 names before that? Every time it was so-and-so begat so-and-so who begat so-and-so. But here, he doesn't do that. He doesn't say Joseph begat Jesus. He doesn't say Joseph fathered Jesus. He says Joseph, husband of Mary, mother of Jesus. In other words, yes, Matthew fuels that rampant suspicion and gossip that Jesus is an illegitimate child. You see, at this point, his Jewish cultured readers are reeling from serious whiplash, or at least they're gasping for fresh gulps of air. If Jesus is related to Jeconiah, he cannot be Messiah. And if he is Messiah, then he cannot be Joseph's son. Talk about family nutmeg. Is Matthew implying that Jesus is not the son of Joseph? That is a spicy Twitter-worthy scandal that is brewing right there, my friends. Does this madman Matthew really have a method? But wait. Matthew solves one real problem, at least. Joseph is the one who is the bona fide descendant of Jeconiah, and therefore Messiah cannot come from Joseph. And now Matthew asserts that Jesus does not come from Joseph. Not only is Matthew fueling the rumor that Joseph is not Jesus' real father, but he's actually counting on it. It's a catch-22. If Jesus is Joseph's real son, then he can't be Messiah. But if he is Messiah, as is clearly stated in the same sentence, then he is not Joseph's son. Which begs the question, whose son is he? And so Matthew, by verse 16 of chapter 1, has his audience exactly where he wants them, on the edge of their seat. So tell me, whose son is Jesus? How does that affect your life? Is he really the Son of God as we celebrate at Christmas time? Because if he is, it changes everything. Does your life really reflect your belief that Jesus is God incarnate? Christmas is all about that.
Bonjour, Jonah here. As you know, Gospel Spice exists to inspire our generation to delight in God. We do this through the podcast, online Bible studies, leadership trainings, and more. We want to serve Christ followers who seek to live a life spiced with the gospel. We want to love God because He first loved us. We want to experience the fullness of life with Him and not be content with stale, boring, leftover faith. Jesus tells us that the most important thing is to love the Lord our God, so we take Him seriously. He adds that we are to love our neighbors as ourselves. Now, there are many ways to do that, but we have always personally felt deep compassion for victims of human trafficking. It is modern-day slavery that revolts the heart of God. And so, here at Gospel Spice, we want to play our part in raising awareness and then financially supporting those who fight this great evil. Now, we would love to invite you to join the team in one of three ways. First, pray Gospel Spice forward. Pray for our guests, our listeners and participants, and for us too. Second, play Gospel Spice forward by telling your friends about us and by please leaving positive reviews and comments on your podcast listening app. And third, pay Gospel Spice forward. Do you know that less than 1% of our listeners are supporting us financially? We need your help. Please pay Gospel Spice forward today. It can be a one-time donation or a monthly one for the amount of your choice. Your donation is fully tax deductible here in the US. Plus, once we cover our costs, a significant portion of your donation will be given back to Christian organizations that fight human trafficking. And we vet them thoroughly so you can know that every dime you give is used for the kingdom of God. Every little bit helps. So be part of the spice of the gospel by becoming a financial partner today. Pray Gospel Spice, play Gospel Spice, and pay Gospel Spice forward. Merci.
Hey, before I get back to the second half of our time together today, Jonah forgot to mention briefly that you need to go to gospelspice.com/Christmas because we have several free gifts there for you, including a full video of a Christmas episode and then a lot more free gifts for you. So gospelspice.com/Christmas, that's our way to celebrate with you. And also we have some pretty cool, beautiful new Gospel Spice merch. There's a Christmas apron, a sweater, t-shirt, stickers, all sorts of things. So gospelspice.com/merch because now's the best time to go Christmas shopping for yourself and your loved ones. I'll see you right there. And here we are back with the second half of our episode today. Does your life really reflect your belief that Jesus is God incarnate? Christmas is all about that. And Matthew solves one problem by creating another, at least to us Westerners. Jesus isn't actually related to Joseph or Jeconiah, which lifts the Voldemort curse. He is the Son of God. He is incarnate by the Holy Spirit through Mary. But that raises a fresh problem for me. Why does Matthew give us this genealogy in the first place if it's not Jesus's? And does it mean that David is not Jesus's ancestor either? Removing the bitter Joseph family nutmeg removes its sweetness too. If Jesus is not Joseph's son, then Jesus is not genetically related to any of these names. Joseph's blood is not flowing in Jesus' veins, so why bother with this genealogy at all? Doesn't prove anything. Was Matthew wasting our time? You see, Matthew is solely concerned with establishing the legal genealogy of Jesus through his adopted father, Joseph. And that is something his Jewish audience would have recognized. In this culture, Joseph is the legal parent of Jesus, so genetics are irrelevant. Matthew provides the legal genealogy of Christ. Jesus was adopted by Joseph, who became his earthly father. He raised him. He taught him how to walk, how to talk, how to hammer a nail. He was a carpenter, and Jesus followed in his footsteps. You see, Matthew actually uses the Jeconiah curse to prove that Jesus is the Son of God himself. He is Messiah precisely because he is not the son of Joseph. And so the audience sighs in relief. And I just did, right? I hadn't realized I had been holding my breath the whole time. Legally speaking, Jesus is a descendant of David through his adopted father, Joseph. He inherits all the perks of an adopted child. But Jesus is not genetically related to Joseph, therefore he did not inherit the Jeconiah curse. So Matthew corners his audience into a very difficult choice. Is Jesus the son of Joseph or the son of God? You pick. Now, Luke gives us another genealogy, and he tells us something Matthew does not. Mary is a descendant of David too, but not through the Jeconiah branch, which means that Jesus is genetically related to David. He is not merely legally adopted into the royal line via Joseph. Jesus has David's true blue blood. Jesus is an illegitimate child from this world's perspective. He grew up with the whispers. He probably wasn't invited to birthday parties. He was tainted. No one believed his mother and her story. She may have convinced her husband, but she wasn't going to fool the good folks in Nazareth, right? And that too is part of the Christmas story. That just doesn't make for warm and fuzzy Christmas cards, right? Each of these 3 sets of 14 names would trigger ancestral memories for Matthew's Jewish audience. Just like the litany of US presidents for you and the long list of French kings for me. Some names, such as Jeconiah, would jar them. And others, such as David, would trigger national pride. And Jeconiah, my friends, is not the only controversial name in this revolutionary genealogy. Who would have thought that Matthew's begats were actually so spicy? Some names in that list are culturally not politically correct. Take the 4 women, for example. Matthew had no business naming women in his genealogy of Messiah. If you're trying to impress the gallery with your ancestry, you don't mention women in first century Jewish culture. And especially not such spicy ones. Take Tamar. Picture a modern-day minority single mom with twins. She's widowed twice, abandoned. Making ends meet is a daily challenge. The constant judgment and shaming gaze stopped bothering her a long time ago. Life has hardened her. She's fighting daily for her boys. She wants a better life for them than she's been handed for herself. You see, Tamar is not even Jewish. She's from Moab, a nation that is despised by the Jews. Moabites are the descendants of the incestuous relationship between Lot and his daughters. Talk about the rotten egg smell. In Genesis 38, we see Tamar taking matters in her own hands when her father-in-law, Judah, deceives her with lies and manipulations 1 time too many. Disguised as a prostitute, she too commits incest with him, and she gets pregnant. Tamar is mentioned later in Ruth 4:12 as the source of blessing. Talk about a destiny turnaround. Her son Perez eventually becomes Jesus' ancestor. That is the ultimate Old Testament claim to fame. An illegitimate child of incest is ancestor to Messiah, the God-man. That is not the most respectable of pedigrees. And yet Matthew chooses to give Tamar a prominent place in his introduction of Jesus to the world. None of us has a spotless pedigree. Tamar's inclusion is a beacon of hope for us and for our bitter, poisonous family fumes too. Are you ashamed of your family's past or of your own? Do you see how Tamar's story weaves hope into yours? And Tamar is arguably not even the shadiest one. Matthew's readers have barely recovered from the shock of her prominent insertion in the storyline when he slams them with Rahab in verse 5. I mean, talk about a reader whiplash. Rahab. Tamar may have played the prostitute once, but Rahab was a pro. And like Tamar, Rahab is not Jewish. You will find her roaming the streets of Jericho in Joshua 2. She's overmade up, and she's underclad. Rahab is a Playboy centerfold kind of girl. She owns a penthouse overlooking Fifth Avenue, Jericho style. She has a view. And she has a private elevator. Did you know that? It's all in Joshua 2:15. Check it out. Rahab is a social media junkie. She has a gaggle of Instagram followers, and she probably follows just as many. She's on top of the news, and it saves her life. That's in Joshua 2 verses 8 to 11. She is spiritually starving, and she will not let her one chance at hope pass. She loves her family fiercely, and she will protect them no matter what. That's in verses 12 and 13 of Joshua 2. This girl, she's a survivor. I can't help but like her. Her story makes history. She marries a salmon, and no fishy jokes here, please. Yes, he is a good catch. We've all heard that one. And she becomes the mother of Boaz. And Boaz is one of Israel's most romantic heroes. Boaz is the son of a reformed Gentile prostitute named Rahab. And Boaz marries Ruth, the Moabitess, and welcomes her into the Jewish faith. Boaz is an Old Testament redeeming hero. No wonder that Matthew mentions Ruth just to give his audience a break. Everyone loves Ruth. There's even a book of the Old Testament bearing her name. Her exemplary love for her mother-in-law, as well as her driven passion for the God of Israel, makes her the iconic bedtime story. Her greatest claim to fame comes after her death, though, because she is King David's very own great-grandma. I doubt that she made him quiche Lorraine, but I wonder what spices she flavored his early childhood with. Nutmeg can taste sweet too, especially in Christmas cookies. David makes nutmeg taste sweet as honey and bitter as lemons down his family tree. His devotion and his worship, his faith and his courage are legendary. Matthew is delighted to prove Jesus' blood connection to David. But David's sin and waywardness, his selfishness, his wandering eye are just as iconic. David committed adultery and murder to obtain his favorite wife, Bathsheba. She had been Uriah's wife. That's in 2 Samuel 11. When Matthew mentions Uriah's wife in verse 6, he reminds his readers that King David was not always the consummate superhero. In verse 16, Matthew contrasts the imperfections of Israel's greatest hero with Jesus, the perfect Messiah. Now, we're back at verse 16 of chapter 1. What a ride. Imagine how Matthew's Jewish audience must have felt. And as he concludes to describe the birth of Jesus, Matthew's point is well taken. Genealogies come in shades of spice, bittersweet, hereditary nutmeg, and all. Nutmeg. Nutmeg evokes quiche Lorraine to me, Frenchie, but I'm very much aware that it might transport you straight to Christmas, the celebration of the birth of Jesus. Cinnamon and cocoa and cloves and peppermint and ginger and nutmeg. That's Christmas. After the roller coaster of Joseph's legacy in Jesus' genealogy in verses 1 to 16, Matthew now focuses on Joseph's role in Jesus' birth in verses 18 to 25. Let's walk a mile or two in this adoptive father's shoes, shall we? In a patriarchal society where honor is the greatest value, Joseph shoulders a life burdened with a heavy cloud of doubt over him and his wife's integrity. People probably reasoned that Mary and Joseph had been intimate earlier than they should have been. Townfolk might be willing to overlook such a slip in betrothal etiquette in the name of love and passion, and our society would do that too. But the doubt lingers. What if Joseph is not the real father? Who has Mary been with? And so Joseph lives with the shame of his wife's supposed adultery. This man has faith, serious, strong, unshakable faith. He's a godly man, enough to be God's choice for his son's adoptive father. I wonder if they tried to explain to the village folks that Jesus was Mary's son, but not Joseph's. I don't think it would give them a whole lot of street cred, right? Do you think they just simply shrug it off and let people gossip? People could do the math. Jesus was conceived before the wedding night. Adultery ran in Joseph's blood, with David and Bathsheba, at the very least. Tongues were loose on rampage, don't you think? You see, it had proved too much for Joseph at first too. He had initially not believed Mary's tale. That's in verses 18 and 19. And he had been willing to separate in a kind and gentle manner. But then, the angel changed everything for everyone, forever. He sealed Joseph's fate and Mary's. The Christmas news were laced with bittersweet nutmeg. Matthew is the only one to give us Joseph's take on it, just like Luke gives us Mary's. How does Matthew know about the angel? Did Joseph tell him? Matthew so intimately gives us Joseph's side of the story, I wonder if they met. Joseph's peculiar absence after Matthew 2 probably indicates that he died before Jesus reached adulthood. And Matthew started following Jesus well after Joseph had died. Could it be that Matthew and Joseph knew each other? Had they met before Jesus was an adult and before Matthew was a believer? Where and when did Matthew and Joseph meet? Matthew 9:1 tells us that Jesus called Matthew while in his hometown, where Matthew worked as a tax collector. Matthew and Jesus both came from Nazareth. It makes me wonder if Joseph and Matthew knew each other when Jesus was growing up. Maybe Joseph shared his story with Matthew when they were young adults, before Matthew became a hated tax collector. It means Matthew saw Jesus grow up. Matthew's recollection of Joseph's Christmas story is flavored with such intimate tenderness of friendship. I don't think he heard it from a third party. And so I wonder, did the angel change everything for Matthew 2 in the long run? Could it be that God planted the Christmas story in Matthew's life as a seed that would eventually grow into such a fierce, indomitable faith that would compel Matthew to follow in Joseph's footsteps and leave everything behind to follow Jesus? What seeds did God plant in your life that eventually matured into faith? What events, angelic or not, have led you where you are today? Ponder this question this week, this first week of Christmas month. And we will meet again next week for the end of the Christmas story in Matthew 1 and 2. Enjoy the spice of the gospel on this first week of Advent.
Hi, Jonah here. Thank you for being part of the Gospel Spice family. If you've enjoyed this episode, you will love receiving our newsletter. It contains value-packed free gifts and rich content each month. It's at gospelspice.com/sign-up. There is always something new and exciting happening around here, and I don't want you to miss out. Sign up at gospelspice.com/sign-up. Did you know Gospel Spice has a YouTube channel? There's exclusive content there too, so join Gospel Spice on YouTube. Also, please give us a star rating and a comment on your podcast listening app. Your reviews actually really do make a difference to help others discover and experience Gospel Spice. As always, we are praying for you. You can confidentially email us your prayer requests and praise items at the email address contact@gospelspice.com. It's our privilege to pray for you. So, I'll leave you with 4 things to do. Please pick one and do it at your convenience. 1. Sign up on our website for our newsletter to receive gifts you're going to love. 2. Find us on YouTube and see what content we've put together to help you grow closer to Jesus. 3. Rate Gospel Spice on your listening app. It's one of the easiest ways to share the gospel. And finally, 4. Tell us how we can pray for you. Merci.